injustice and violence, there is Ashura, there is Karbala. The second inspiration for my thoughts on Imam Hussein comes from Mohandas Gandhi, who said, "I have learned from Hussein how to be oppressed yet victorious." And I was reminded of Gandhi's words as I listened to Key's story. Arrested on suspicion of being members of the Dawa party, Keys and others were held in a security centre in a suburban district of Baghdad in the early 1980s. Keys was severely tortured and had several bones broken. He revealed to us the scars on his wrists and legs from over 20 years ago. He told us how after 3 days of torture his hands were so big and swollen that it was almost comical. He felt so thirsty but was refused water and was left in a cell to die. He remembers the horrendous pain in his body, the bleeding from his eyes and nose, his feet and nails. His legs were broken and his shoulders dislocated. He thinks he lost consciousness and then felt that he was in the shrine of Imam Hussein. 2 scholars came. One moved ahead of the other to lead the congregation in noon prayer. After the prayers, the leader invited him to come and sit beside him. He went over to him and he was offered 2 bowls, one with grapes in it and the other with dates in it, neither of which Keith enjoyed eating. He chose 3 dates, and at that point he regained consciousness. His thirst and hunger had disappeared, and he felt strengthened in his spirit and able to remain steadfast to the end. The guards' attempts to recruit him to spy on the others detained with him failed, and it was his faith in God and in the inspiration he drew from the story of Imam Hussein that helped him through. The story of Imam Hussein helped him to become victorious in the face of oppression. It is the power of Hussein's story and the effects that it clearly had on these people who faced so much suffering that impressed me most. S.H.N. Jaffrey, in The Origins and Early Development of Shia Islam, argues that Hussein was aware that victory through military might would only be temporary, because the inevitability of a stronger power emerging, whereas victory achieved through suffering and sacrifice is everlasting and leaves permanent imprints on people's consciousness, as it did with Keys. And this spirituality elicited in me a sympathy, a note of recognition, as it echoed for me some of the power I experienced in the redemptive story of God's work in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I was also drawn by the stories of Hussein's concern for the marginalized. I was told the story about the black scars on his back after he had been martyred. People asked about them. His son explained that these were caused by carrying sacks of provisions to the homes of widows and orphans. He had to do this at night in order to hide his good deeds from other men. This reminds me of Jesus' call in the gospel. But when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your alms may be done in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Hussein's suffering and sacrifice gives people the spiritual strength and encouragement to resist oppression, a will that is fed by the hope of the coming of the Mahdi, the 12th Imam, when there will be no more fighting among the people, since the justice of God will rule and will move any reason for conflict and warfare. This will be a golden age of peace and harmony under the governance of God. Again, this has strong resonances for me of the Christian tradition, the eschatological hope of the kingdom to come, a kingdom whose coming into being has begun. Christians believe with the resurrection of Jesus Christ, as St. Paul says in the first epistle to the Corinthians. But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have died. For since death came through a human being, the resurrection of the dead has also come through a human being. For as in Adam all die, so all will be made alive in Christ. But each in his own order, Christ the first fruits, then at his coming those who belong to Christ. Then comes the end, when he hands over the kingdom of God to the Father after he has destroyed every ruler and every authority and power. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death, for God has put all things in subjection under his feet. When all things are subjected to him, then the Son himself will be subjected to the one who put all things in subjection under him, so that God may be all in all. There is so much violence in our world. When I look at the world today, and Iraq, I think in particular, in 2007 when this was written, and see the horrendous escalation of violence that continues day by day, I reflect on the misguided belief that violence of any kind, whether terrorist, resistance, militia, army or occupier, can lead to liberation or healing. And I'm reminded of the story I was given by a young woman at the University of Kabul after I had addressed a conference. She passed me a letter in Arabic. Through my companion, she asked that whenever I speak or write of Iraq, I tell her story. She wrote about her mother, who lost her own mother and sister and uncle, all of whom were murdered by the old regime. Her mother never recovered from this deep loss and was deeply depressed and disturbed for the rest of her life. The young woman felt that she had no mother. She wrote, "It is easy to show when someone has been killed. There is a body that is dead. How do you show when someone has killed someone by destroying their soul?" She felt she had experienced no love in her childhood, that her mother was absent, too traumatized, too destroyed, too broken, and she too felt soulless because she had not experienced love. Then in her late teens, she was introduced to a man who was to become her husband. He showed her love and kindness, and through this love brought her healing, confidence and hope. They were married and set up home together in Baghdad. Then the coalition invaded, and during the bombing in Baghdad, her husband went across the street from their home to get some water from a neighbouring house, and a bomb dropped upon the building and he was killed. The man who had brought her healing and spiritual liberation from the effects of the brutality of Saddam Hussein's regime was now killed by a bomb dropped by those claiming to bring liberation from dictatorship. It is too easy to forget that the bombs dropped from aeroplanes by states under the so-called legitimacy of war and for the so-called liberation can easily be as indiscriminate as a bomb attached to a twisted soul who sees walking into a marketplace and killing himself and those around him as martyrdom or as an act of liberation. Violence can never bring liberation or real hope, only destruction and death. On our way back to England, we found ourselves again, because of border difficulties, with some time to spare in Damascus. Hussein wanted to go shopping for a present for his wife in the markets of Damascus, and we wandered through the streets talking and remembering the last few weeks. We also shared our frustration of not being able to return home to friends and family. Maybe I reflected to Hussein as we looked at shops, God has something else for us to hear, to discover before we return to England. Soon afterwards we entered a clothes shop and we were met by a friendly young man who, in the process of showing Hussein some clothes, entered into a conversation. Realizing that we had just returned from Iraq, he then told us that his brother had been killed in Iraq. He was a martyr, he said, and he revealed to us that his brother had been a person who had driven the truck into the Red Cross building in Baghdad in 2003. Hussein and our new acquaintance had a long conversation. This kind-faced man slowly revealed to Hussein that he was not very sure that his brother's actions were those of a martyr, and he told us that his family were not convinced either. He told us that his brother had a wife and 2 small children whom the family now cared for. Was he a martyr, the young man asked Hussein? Or was he indoctrinated by people giving him a false belief in the righteousness of such an action? Suddenly we were faced with the reality of the suicide bomber, an ordinary young man with a young family in Damascus, a brother who works in a shop, and a family who were left distraught and confused by his action. How do we react to such stories? How can we respond as people of faith to the increasing insanity of our world and the continuing violence in places like Iran? As a Christian, I find comfort in Jesus' words that in the face of violence, wars and catastrophes, we are not to be despondent or to speculate, but to hold on to the truth of our faith. Hussein went to the battlefield knowing he was going to die, but knowing that victory in battle would not be any victory at all. Hussein was victorious because he won our hearts, and we know his cause was true. Success in worldly terms is not necessarily a sign of victory or of God's power. Mother Teresa of Calcutta said we should all pray, "O God, break open my heart so that the whole world may fall in." In a world of violence, we are called to cultivate compassion. In a world of self-righteous judgment and retaliation, we are called to practice mercy. Be merciful, says Jesus, as your Father is merciful. And as the Quran states at the beginning of each surah, in the name of God, the compassionate and the merciful. Compassion is a beautiful thing, and it is only our turning again to embrace God's compassion and mercy that will save us in the end. We need to lament, we need to break open our hearts for the suffering in the world, for the victims of violence and torture, and yes, the perpetrators of violence and torture, those twisted souls, be they powerful and ruthless tyrants, democratically elected presidents and prime ministers, or an indoctrinated young Syrian man with a family and a brother who works in the market shop. It was a year after I'd been to Iraq that I discovered Mother Teresa's prayer. It spoke to me of my experience in Lady Zainab's shrine in Damascus. There God broke open my heart for the people of Iraq. There God prepared me for the journey into Iraq. There in that mosque God met me, challenged me, and spoke to me through the Iranian pilgrim's lamentation. I began to use Mother Teresa's prayer each day in the offices as a meditation. And over the weeks and months, her prayer changed, and I felt God spoke through the prayer. And my words changed from Mother Teresa's prayer to a sense of hearing God say to me, "My child, I am the broken heart that lets the whole world fall in." And the prayer revealed to me once again the truth about God as I understand it as a Christian, the truth about the cross. God is the broken heart. We have a God who breaks open his heart so that the whole world may fall in. As Paul says, this is foolishness to the intellectual and a scandal to the religious. But this is the God, as Christians, we proclaim. In Catholicism,